The chill of November swept through Stockholm streets in 1520, carrying with it the quiet tension that had gripped the city since the Danish King Kristian II had taken power. The people of Stockholm were no strangers to strife, but this time it felt different. The roots of the conflict stretched back decades, fueled by the fractious nature of the Kalmar Union, a fragile alliance between Denmark, Norway, and Sweden. Sweden, under the leadership of the Sture family, had repeatedly resisted Danish dominance, striving for greater independence. Sten Sture the Younger, a national hero to many Swedes, had led this resistance until his untimely death earlier that year. His death left a power vacuum and a simmering resentment among the Swedish nobility toward the Danish crown. Kristian, eager to cement his authority, had launched a military campaign to subdue the rebellious Swedes. His forces, bolstered by mercenaries and loyalists, defeated the Swedish army in several key battles. After the fall of Stockholm, Kristian sought to portray himself as a magnanimous victor. He promised reconciliation, peace, and stability. Invitations were extended to Sweden's most influential figures, drawing them to the capital to witness his coronation and partake in the grand feast to follow. It was a display of Kristian's supposed goodwill, or so he claimed. But behind the king's carefully constructed facade, there was something darker brewing. Anna, a servant in the royal kitchens, had noticed it. She had overheard hushed conversations between the king's advisors as they inspected the preparations for the feast. Words like justice and heresy were thrown about, accompanied by knowing glances and cryptic smiles. Something about the way they spoke chilled her to the bone, but what could she do? She was a mere kitchen maid, a cog in the grand machinery of courtly life. The coronation was a spectacle to behold. The cathedral echoed with the solemn chants of priests as Kristian knelt before the altar, his head bowed in mock humility. The crown, heavy and ornate, was placed upon his head, and for a moment he looked every bit the benevolent ruler he pretended to be. The congregation erupted in applause, though Anna noticed that not all hands clapped with enthusiasm. The Swedish nobility, those who had resisted Kristian's claim to the throne, watched with tight-lipped restraint. Their leader, Gustav Trolle, had been restored to his position as Archbishop of Uppsala, but many saw him as a puppet of the Danish crown. Kristian's victory had come at a cost, and the tensions were palpable. As the festivities moved to the grand hall, the atmosphere lightened. The tables were laden with roasted meats, fine cheeses, and spiced wine. Music filled the air, and the nobles appeared to let their guard down. Kristian moved among his guests, his demeanor warm and convivial. He toasted to the union of the Nordic kingdoms, raising his goblet high. "Let this be a new beginning," he proclaimed, his voice booming across the hall. "Let bygones be bygones." For a moment, it seemed as if he meant it. The nobles, lulled by the wine and the king's words, began to relax. Laughter echoed through the hall, and the barriers between former enemies seemed to blur. But not everyone was fooled. Among the guests was Bishop Matthias of Strängnäs, a sharp-eyed cleric who had long opposed Kristian's ambitions. He noticed the subtle cues, the way the king's guards lingered near the exits, the fleeting glances exchanged between the Danes. He said nothing, but a sense of foreboding gripped him. That night, as the revelry continued, Anna's unease grew. She had been tasked with delivering a special cask of wine to the king's table. As she approached, she overheard Kristian speaking in a low voice to his confidant, Didrik Slagek. "Tomorrow?" the king said, his tone icy. "It ends." The next morning dawned cold and gray. The feasting hall was silent, its grandeur now shadowed by an eerie stillness. The king summoned his guests to an emergency council in the castle's main chamber. The nobles, many nursing headaches from the previous night's indulgence, gathered reluctantly. When they arrived, they found the room lined with armed guards. The doors slammed shut behind them. Kristian entered, his expression grave. Beside him stood Archbishop Trolle, clutching a parchment. The archbishop's voice rang out as he began to read. In the name of His Majesty King Kristian, and by the authority of the Holy Church, we declare that certain individuals present here today stand accused of heresy. The room erupted in outrage. Heresy! One nobleman shouted. What is this madness? But the king's guards were swift to silence dissent. One by one, names were read aloud. Lords and bishops, men who had stood against Kristian's rule. The accused were seized and dragged to the castle's dungeon. Bishop Matthias, one of the first to be named, looked directly at the king as he was taken away. You call this justice? He spat. Kristian did not reply. Word of the arrests spread quickly through Stockholm. By evening, the castle courtyard had been transformed into a grim stage. Wooden scaffolds were erected, and the accused were paraded before the gathered crowd. The charges of heresy were read once more, though they were little more than a pretext. This was not about religion. It was about eliminating opposition. Anna watched from the shadows, her heart pounding. She had slipped away from the kitchens, unable to stay away from the unfolding events. The crowd's murmurs turned to gasps as the executions began. Heads rolled, blood staining the cobblestones. Among the condemned was Bishop Matthias, whose final words were a prayer for Sweden's freedom. The spectacle lasted for 2 days. By the end, nearly 100 people had been executed, their bodies left in the square as a warning. The people of Stockholm looked on in stunned silence, the weight of the massacre sinking in. Kristian had not only broken the spirit of the Swedish nobility, he had shown the world the price of defiance. But Kristian's triumph was short-lived. The bloodbath, intended to secure his rule, ignited a fire of rebellion. News of the massacre spread, reaching the ears of Gustav Vasa, a nobleman who had escaped Kristian's wrath. Vasa would go on to rally the Swedish people, leading them in a war of independence that would forever change the course of history. For Anna, the events of those days remained etched in her memory. She returned to her work in the royal kitchens, her role as an invisible observer intact. But she carried with her the knowledge of what she had seen, the understanding that even the mightiest kings could not escape the consequences of their actions. And as she looked out over the city, she could almost hear the whispers of the fallen, a solemn reminder that justice, though delayed, would one day prevail.